Hello, everyone. Welcome to my presentation for the second lesson. Last time we were talking about the scientificity of history, and we introduced the two schools of thought that emerged as a result of the kind of argument that exists in history. So today, remember, we were talking about the positivists and the idealists based on how they were arguing on the nature of historical thinking. So we are now going to ask ourselves a very simple question. What is science? So we will say that the term science is used to mean disciplines like chemistry, physics, biology. In other words, we refer to them as exact sciences or natural sciences. The term science is used to mean an organized branch of knowledge. Therefore, the term science to cover such as political science, sociology, ecology, anthropology, etc. In this sense, history is a science. Last time we were saying that positivists are alluding that there is no fundamental difference between history and exact sciences. So the same way we say that chemistry is a science, it's the same way we will also say that history is a science because they both have an organized branch of knowledge. That's an argument that positivists are clinging on. But quite the contrary, in our next paragraph, we are going to see how idealists are counterattacking that observation made by positivists. So they're saying that history is not a science like physics and biology because they deal with objects that can directly or indirectly be touched, measured, and evaluated in laboratory conditions. They deal with concrete and verifiable objects, while history deals with the past human experiences, which was a result of human thoughts. Historians deals with past human behaviors. He can only explain it through inference. He can reenact it in his own mind. Historical knowledge is therefore inferential, while scientific knowledge is experimental. That one now creates a difference between history and exact sciences. Because remember, in exact sciences, we are dealing with objects can be or touched, objects can be measured, objects can be evaluated in laboratory conditions. Remember, in history, we don't need to take our findings into the laboratory to evaluate them. Then again, they are saying that historical knowledge is inferential because we try to reenact the past endeavors, while scientific knowledge is experimental because we have to take them to the lab and experiment them. So that alone brings the aspect of the differences that we have between history and exact sciences as far as idealists are concerned, their arguments, that is. However, there is a sense in which history can be regarded as a science. Like other forms of knowledge, history is an organized discipline, we've said that, which historians raises and answers important questions. They attempt to answer important questions about human activities in the past by analyzing documents obtained. It's only after analyzing all the valuable information that he can claim to know what happened and why it happened. The knowledge obtained is no way inferior to knowledge obtained by natural scientists through observation and experiment. The difference is only through procedure. So you realize that when it comes to the presentation of knowledge, the presentation of information that we've obtained, both history and exact sciences becomes the same because there is no discipline that we can say is inferior. So the results you find from your experiment, you as a scientist, is the same result that you as a historian, me as a historian, will also obtain from my own findings. There is no inferior subject. So there is also a question whether history is an art. The answer would be that history is a science as well as an art. As mentioned earlier, history is a science because it's an organized body of knowledge. It can also be an art because once gathered and analyzed, the facts should be in a manner that it attracts and educates the reader. The historian should use the same style of writing like novelists. Remember, you tend to write as a novelist to make your history interesting. And the aspect of making it interesting quantifies or qualifies as history to become an art because it becomes an eye catcher, unlike what we do in exact sciences where we have to analyze our findings, our data in a laboratory setup. within history, we only need to make our presentations very interesting. We need to make it interesting so that it can reach a wide range of audience. How do you reach a wide range of audience? You must make your presentations very, very interesting. That's why we borrow some styles from novelists. So it's on that what makes the difference is that now novelists are more fictitious, while historians tries to be very factual. But the aspect of making our presentations very interesting qualifies as history to be an art. So the question whether history is a science or not, and whether history is an art have continued to bother historians because the discipline is new until the 19th century that the German historian led by Leopold von Ranke seriously began to consider the nature of history. Until then, history was considered as part of literature, and one did not need expertise to write history. The history was then based on fact, source, and evidence. So we say that before the 19th century, before the likes of Leopold von Ranke came on board to introduce scientific history that was being written back then could be regarded as history written by amateurs, and the history written by an amateur cannot qualify to be an objective history, cannot qualify to be a scientific history, because you need to be trained on how to write a good history. That's why we are saying that until the 19th century, history was still not regarded as a science because of the kind of writers that were writing history. We were not having any expertise until the likes of Leopold von Ranke had to come on board in the 19th century, to the onset of 19th century, to introduce or to advocate for the writing of exact history based on evidence. Remember, back then, history that was being written was, we used to call it an iBird's point of view. It was being written from an iBird's point of view, not from a wider spectrum. So since 19th century was a period of great advance of exact sciences, some people, among them historians, began to look forward to when history will be as accurate as sciences. This led to a clamor that history should be a science. So we remind ourselves, or we say that there was this desire to make history as accurate as the exact science. So we say that this desire led to a clamor that history, should be a science, because remember, sciences are very exact, they are very accurate based on the findings that are found in the laboratory setup. So historians also began to have this feeling that a time should now come where the history that we study should also be as exact as the sciences that we also have on board. Though history did not become an exact science, the clamor for exactness in history led to the birth of critical history. This view started in Germany, then spread to Europe before reaching America in 1880s. Remember, we talked about Leopold von Ranke, a German historian or scholar. Then again, we are also bringing the aspect of the exactness in history. So with that in mind, the whole aspect now began to spread in Europe. How are we going to make history to be as exact as a natural science? So from Germany, it did spread all the way to Europe and finally reaching America in the 1880s. The gospel of making history as exact as possible. So in the Horn, the movement led to the establishment of history as a respected discipline in the universities. In other words, the movement tried to make history more scientific and more exact. So remember, the moment history has been introduced in universities, that alone shows us that that thorough training of history was now gaining momentum. That was back then in the 1880s in countries like the United States of America. And we say that the movement tried to make history more scientific and more exact. That was the main desire that they wanted to ensure that they achieve at the end of the day. Following the footsteps of Leopold von Ranke, the Americans set up the Scientific School of American History in 1880. This school of historical studies revolutionized history in the following ways. So remember, there is still that desire of making history as exact as possible, leading to the establishment of the School of American History, and it had the following, we say that through its revolution, it revolutionized history in the following ways, as listed below. Demanded accuracy in quotation and insisted on accurate documentation. Yeah, it's all about history being very accurate, then encourage the writing of all forms of history, social, economic, and political history. This was in contrast to previous historians, we centered around political history because of availability of resources or the deeds of great men. So remember, in the political era, historians were just focusing on political history, which was full of hero worshipping. They were not looking at history in its totality. So that's something that the School of American History wanted to abolish so that they could look at history in its totality. However, there are those who feel that history should not be viewed as a science. So if we say that, remember, we are now referring to the idealists who are saying that history is a science, but only to some extent. So in other words, it's both a science and art. So one group led by Joy Trevelyan-Macaulay, that periodization, insists that history is both a science and an art, scientific only in terms of collecting and weighing evidence. So remember, according to Macaulay, saying that a history is only a science when it comes to the all aspect of collecting data in the field, because the same way a scientist would go to the field and collect data is the same way a historian would also go to the field to collect data. But now when it comes to analyzing this data, now history ceases to be an art, because remember, a historian will look for a nice way of making his or her presentation be very interesting, while a scientist will go to the laboratory to analyze his or her data. So that's what makes the difference. So J.B. Barrie, who is a positivist, stated that history is a science no less, no more. By that, he meant that history was a science just like physics and chemistry. What he had in mind was, remember, he's the one who was alluding that history is a science no more, no less in his most quoted dictum. What he meant was that the great advances in the techniques of finding and exploiting evidence by 1903 made it possible for historians to claim their status to make true statement about the past. Therefore, history was not inferior. So history ceased to be inferior from the onset of the 19th century. That's according to J.B. Barrie. Secondly, once the historian had arrived at a true statement about the past, his work was over. The historian concern was with the truth and no more, hence the quote, no more, no less. So according to J.B. Barrie, historians should only be interested in arriving at the fact. After acquiring that, after arriving at that, your work now ceases. You don't need to go, and interpret your facts. Barrie wanted to make it clear that a time had come to divorce history from literature and to extract it from the personality of the historian. So initially, history was part and parcel of literature, and the time had come when history was now supposed to be divorced from literature so that it could be an independent discipline. That's according to J.B. Barrie, so that the whole aspect of scientificity could now come out clearly from history by deviating or by divorcing it from science, from literature, I mean. Then Barrie may have stated that historian had arrived at lab and agreed procedures of answering questions about what occurred. He should have also known that historians do not establish facts. Yeah, remember, idealists are now coming on board to counterattack Barrie by telling you that no, you don't just arrive at fact and stop at that. You have to go ahead and interpret these facts. So let us stop at that as we wait for the next lesson to see how these arguments are still continuous. Thank you very much.